The rotors were still spinning when the shouting cut through the noise. Dust rolled across the ramp in thick waves, burning my eyes, sticking to my teeth. I had one boot on the metal when I heard him. A Navy SEAL lieutenant, close enough that I could see the veins in his neck, his finger aimed straight at my chest. "Go home," he said, not loud, not emotional, just flat. Final. I stopped where I was. I had flown into hot zones before. I had taken fire. I had pulled broken crews out of burning wreckage, but the weight in his voice hit harder than any of that. Behind him, 24 military working dogs stood in a perfect line, leashed, alert, trained to obey before thought could catch up. The other pilot murmured my name, but I did not turn. My eyes locked on the dogs. Every one of them had gone still. No barking, no pacing. Just quiet focus. Then one dog stepped forward. Then another. Leashes snapped tight. Handlers barked commands. Hands grabbed harnesses. Protocol began to crack in front of us. Still, the dogs did not move back. They sat. They waited. All of them facing me. That was the moment I understood this mission no longer belonged to rank, orders, or argument. Subscribe to my channel, Lady Veteran Stories, for more real military stories, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. My name is Captain Rachel Holloway. In the year 2014, I was flying combat rescue out of a small joint operations base tucked into the desert outside Silver Creek, Nevada. Most people would never find it on a map. A handful of low buildings baked by the sun. One long runway cutting through dust and scrub. Wind that never really stopped, just changed direction. By then, I had been flying rescue missions for 6 years. Medevac. Extraction. Personnel recovery. The words sounded clean when written in reports, but the work never was. My job, stripped down to its truth, was simple. Get in, get people out. Alive, if the day allowed it. Broken, if it did not. Empty aircraft, if there was no other choice. That morning started the same way most of them did. A dim briefing room that smelled like burnt coffee. Styrofoam cups lined along the table, forgotten halfway through. Weather charts taped crooked to the wall, corners peeling. Someone clicked through slides while the rest of us stared, listening without really hearing. The mission was stamped routine, a joint training exercise. Navy SEAL platoon, military working dog unit rotating in from the East Coast. Nothing unusual, nothing urgent. I was listed as standby air support, not lead. Not command, not decision maker. Just there in case something went wrong. In my experience, something always did. The dogs arrived just after sunrise. 24 of them unloaded with precision. Muscles tight, eyes sharp. Each one paired with a handler who moved like they shared a nervous system. These were not show dogs or base mascots. They were special operations capable, dual trained for tracking and explosives detection. Conditioned for aggression control under fire. Their handlers trusted them more than radios, more than maps, more than promises. And the dogs trusted their handlers, no one else. From the moment I walked onto the flight line, I could feel the space around me tighten. Some of the SEALs gave polite nods. Professional, distant. Others looked past me as if I was part of the equipment. One of them asked if I was looking for the medical tent. Another asked, not quietly, who had signed off on me flying today. I had learned over the years how to let that kind of thing slide. You do not survive long in rescue work if every comment gets under your skin. You learn to absorb it, store it somewhere quiet, and move on. Most days, that was enough, but Lieutenant Mark Keller did not bother pretending. He did not glare, he did not argue. He simply did not acknowledge me unless required. When he did speak, it was clipped and minimal. Orders to his team, corrections to his handlers. Silence when I was in the room. The message was clear without ever being said out loud. He did not think I belonged there. I stayed focused on my checks. Fuel, instruments, crew readiness. I told myself his opinion did not matter. I had an aircraft to fly and a crew that depended on me being sharp. By mid-morning, the exercise shifted. The scenario changed from basic movement drills to simulated downed aircraft recovery. Terrain surged through uneven ground and narrow washes. The dogs were deployed first, just as planned. I watched from the edge of the airfield as they disappeared into the landscape, handlers moving low and fast behind them. At first, everything looked normal. Radios crackled. Position updates came in steady. Too steady. Then the pauses started. Short gaps. Half seconds of silence where there should have been noise. Handlers repeating commands a little louder than before. Dogs hesitating at points that should have been simple. Nothing dramatic. Nothing you could point to and call a failure, but enough to make my shoulders tighten. I had flown long enough to recognize the feeling when a mission stopped behaving like it was supposed to. Training or not, the body notices before the brain catches up. Something in the rhythm was off. The dogs were working, but not cleanly. Their handlers kept glancing back toward the flight line, toward my aircraft. Lieutenant Keller brushed it off, said the dogs were picking up handler tension. Said it was normal during joint exercises. Said everyone needed to relax. Then the scenario escalated again, a simulated crash site deeper in the terrain. Limited visibility. Time pressure introduced. The dogs advanced to a ridgeline and stopped, not slowed. Not cautious, stopped. Commands were issued. Hand signals followed. The dogs held their ground, no barking. No pulling, just refusal. That was when the call came in, not simulated, not part of the exercise. A real aircraft had gone down during a separate training run. One pilot unaccounted for, terrain similar to the exercise area. Light, fading fast. Training ended in that instant. I was cleared to prep for launch, and the mission stopped being theoretical. The first thing I noticed was the radio delay, not a failure. Not static, just a half beat of silence before replies came back. Enough to make you pause, not enough to justify stopping anything. In aviation, those are the moments that matter most. The ones small enough to ignore if you want to. The second thing was the dogs. They were working, technically, tracking, pausing, moving again. But the handlers kept glancing back over their shoulders toward the airfield, toward my aircraft. It was subtle. A look held a fraction longer than necessary. A hand tightening on a leash that did not need it. Dogs read those things faster than humans ever could. Lieutenant Keller dismissed it immediately. Said the handlers were tense because it was a joint exercise. Said dogs mirrored stress. Said it was nothing to overthink. I wanted to believe him. Training runs often feel messy before they smooth out. But I had flown too many real missions to ignore patterns when they started repeating. Radios lagging. Dogs hesitating. People pretending not to notice. That pattern never led anywhere good. When the scenario shifted to simulated crash recovery, the tone changed. Time pressure was introduced. Light conditions degraded. The terrain narrowed into washes and ridgelines where sound carried strangely and visibility dropped fast. The dogs advanced ahead of the handlers, just as trained, noses low, bodies tight. They reached a ridgeline and stopped. Not slowed. Not confused. Stopped. Commands came quickly at first. Calm. Professional. Hand signals followed. Clear. Familiar. The dogs did not respond. They did not pull forward or strain back. They simply held position, staring down into the terrain on the far side of the ridge. Handlers tried again. Voices sharpened. Corrections followed. Still nothing. Lieutenant Keller's patience snapped. He ordered a reset, told the handlers to pull the dogs back into formation and advance without hesitation. said we did not have time for this, said the exercise was getting sloppy. That was when the call came in, not simulated, not part of the plan, real. A separate training aircraft had gone down less than 30 miles away, not hard data yet, just a broken transmission and a last known position, one pilot unaccounted for. Terrain rough, sun already sliding low. Night was coming whether we were ready or not. Training ended in that moment. You could feel it in the way everyone stopped pretending. Radios cleared. Voices dropped. Movements became deliberate. I was cleared to prep for launch. I turned toward my aircraft, already running through fuel checks and approach options in my head, when Keller stepped into my path. He did not raise his voice. He did not touch me. He simply stood there and said the dogs were not deploying with me, said the terrain was too tight, said canine transport would slow response time, said it was not my call to make. On paper, he was right. The dogs were his responsibility. The ground element belonged to him. I was air support, nothing more. But even as he spoke, I could feel something shifting behind him. The dogs had gone quiet again. No whining, no pacing, no restless movement, just attention. Every one of them was turned toward the flight line, toward my aircraft. Toward me. Handlers noticed too. I could see it in the way they hesitated before responding to Keller's orders, in the way hands hovered instead of pulling leashes tight. Dogs do not break discipline without a reason, and they do not all do it at once. I met Keller's eyes and said nothing. There was no point arguing in that moment. You cannot logic your way through instinct when it is already screaming. He told me to wait, told me command would decide. Seconds stretched. The radio stayed silent longer than it should have. Behind him, one dog shifted its weight forward. Then another. Then another. Not aggressive, not chaotic. Intentional, focused. Handlers tried to correct him, voices dropping into warning tones. The dogs did not respond. They were already locked onto something they trusted. That was when I understood that whatever was happening had moved beyond rank, paperwork, and planned chains of command. Animals trained to read threat and intent under fire were telling us something did not belong to procedure. Keller turned, finally seeing what I had seen for the last several minutes. His jaw tightened. For the first time since I met him, uncertainty crossed his face. The dogs were not watching the terrain. They were watching me. And whether he liked it or not, the decision was already forming without him. Command came back with a compromise that felt clean on paper and dangerous in practice. Air extraction would proceed immediately. Ground element would follow once routes were cleared. The dogs would stay back until the situation stabilized. It was the kind of decision made by people looking at maps instead of shadows. I pushed back carefully, not with emotion, not with attitude, just facts. The terrain was broken and tight, full of blind spots where sound carried wrong and movement disappeared fast. Visibility was already degrading, and secondary threats were always a possibility when an aircraft went down, even during training. Every minute the pilot stayed exposed increased the risk. Air alone could reach him fast, but ground support without canine eyes was a gamble. Lieutenant Keller did not let me finish. He cut me off without raising his voice. Said his dogs were not flying with a distraction. Said they were not trained to operate around uncertainty in the air. Said this was not a debate. I knew then I would not convince him. And I knew it did not matter. My orders were clear. Launch when cleared. Support recovery. So I turned away and climbed into my cockpit. The engines began to spin, rotors biting into the air, dust lifting in thick sheets across the flight line. Crew chiefs moved with practice speed, signaling through the noise. I ran through my checks by muscle memory, hands steady even as tension pressed in behind my ribs. That was when the handlers started to struggle. Every single dog pulled against the leash at once. Not frantic, not panicked, not panicked. Focused. Leaning forward with full body weight, muscles locked, eyes fixed on my aircraft. Harnesses went taut. Handlers dug boots into the dirt, bracing, trying to hold lines that had never failed them before. Names were shouted over the engines. Sharp, familiar commands followed. Correction tones, used sparingly in normal operations, were layered on top of each other. Nothing worked. The dogs did not bark. They did not snarl. They did not try to break free. They just pulled. Staff Sergeant Olivia Barnes was one of the handlers closest to the ramp. She had been working dogs longer than I had been flying. Calm under pressure, methodical. I saw her glance from her dog to me and back again, her face drained of color under the dust. "They never do this," she said, loud enough for me to read her lips through the glass. The radio crackled with overlapping voices. Someone called for a hold. Someone else called for command. Keller pushed his way forward, anger sharp in his movements now, discipline slipping. He pointed toward my aircraft, then at the handlers, shouted for shutdown. Shouted for control. Shouted at me to go home. Even through the cockpit insulation, I heard it, the same words as before. This time, louder, sharper, desperate. I did not respond. I kept my hands where they were. My crew looked back at me, waiting for direction I could not give. And then the dogs broke formation. Not one. Not two. All of them. Leashes slipped from hands or were yanked free as handlers lost balance. Dogs surged forward together, a wave of controlled intent, crossing lines they had never crossed without command. They did not scatter. They did not collide. They moved around each other with the kind of precision that only comes from deep training and shared purpose. They stopped short of the ramp. Sat. Lay down. Blocked movement. Handlers froze, caught between training and disbelief. No one had ever trained for this. No doctrine existed for 24 military working dogs refusing an order at the same time. Dust settled slowly around them as the engines continued to spin. Keller stood in the middle of it all, fists clenched, jaw tight, authority cracking under the weight of something he could not control. Command came over the radio again. This time, no one spoke over it. Proceed, just one word. I looked straight ahead and eased the throttle forward. Whatever line we thought existed between air and ground had already been erased. Protocol is clear about dogs. They do not choose missions. They do not question intent. They do not decide where they belong. They follow commands, follow handlers, follow training written in repetition and reward. That is what makes them reliable. That is also what made that moment impossible to ignore. All 24 dogs moved toward my aircraft as if answering the same signal. They did not rush. They did not panic. They advanced with purpose, spreading out just enough to block movement without creating confusion. Some sat. Some lay down. Others stood, still and focused. The ramp became a barrier made of muscle, discipline, and intent. Handlers stopped moving. Hands hovered in midair, voices caught in throats. Every instinct drilled into them said to correct the behavior. Every year of experience told them this was not disobedience. This was something else. No one had trained for this. No manual covered it. No after-action report had ever prepared anyone for 24 military working dogs refusing to stand down together. The radio crackled, then went quiet. Seconds stretched longer than they should have. Engines hummed. Dust drifted. Somewhere far off, a clock kept running for a downed pilot who did not know we were arguing about procedure. Finally, command came back on the net. One sentence. Proceed. Nothing else. No explanation. No debate. Lieutenant Keller looked at me then, really looked at me. The anger had burned out, leaving something harder to name. He stared like someone forced to swallow a truth they were not ready for. He did not apologize. He did not acknowledge what had just happened. He simply stepped aside. Handlers moved automatically after that. Training took over where shock left off. Leashes were recovered. Dogs were guided up the ramp, loaded tight, secured fast. Space was limited. Weight calculations were rewritten on the fly. Harnesses clipped to anchor points not originally meant for them. Controlled chaos, executed with professional speed. The aircraft filled with heat, breath, and tension. Dogs settled in low, eyes tracking movement, ears tuned to sounds humans filtered out. Handlers wedged themselves into any space they could find, hands resting on familiar backs, grounding themselves as much as the animals. I lifted us off the ground before anyone had time to second-guess the decision. The aircraft rose heavy, sluggish under the extra weight, rotors biting hard into the air. Instruments stayed within limits, just barely. My crew watched gauges and me in equal measure, waiting for any sign of hesitation. There was none. Once we were clear of the airfield, the noise settled into a steady roar. No one spoke, not over the intercom, not on the net, not even hand signals passed between seats. It was the quiet that comes when everyone understands the stakes without needing them explained. I flew low and direct, choosing speed over comfort, scanning terrain the way rescue pilots learn to do, looking for anything that did not belong. The dogs tracked it too. Heads turned in unison at sounds I could not hear. Bodies tensed at changes in airflow. They were working already, even before their paws touched the ground. I thought about how close we had come to leaving them behind, about how easily protocol could have overridden instinct, about how thin the line was between doing things the right way and doing the necessary thing. Behind me, a handler whispered to her dog, voice barely audible over the engines. The dog pressed closer, steady and calm. We were airborne. Committed. Whatever waited for us on the ground, we would meet it together. And for the first time since the day began, no one questioned who belonged on that aircraft. The crash site revealed itself in pieces before it made sense as a whole. A torn strip of metal half buried in sand. A dark smear where fuel had burned hot and fast. Debris scattered farther than it should have been, as if the ground itself had tried to reject the impact. There was no beacon signal. No flashing strobe. Nothing guiding us in except instinct and what the dogs were already telling us. I brought the aircraft down as close as terrain allowed, rotors chopping the night air, dust and loose gravel exploding outward. Before the skids fully settled, the handlers were moving. Doors open, harnesses unclipped. Dogs dropped to the ground and surged forward, noses low, bodies tight, already working. There was no hesitation. No confusion. Whatever had drawn them to my aircraft earlier was pulling them now through darkness and wreckage with absolute certainty. The handlers followed at a distance that let the dogs lead. Radio stayed quiet unless necessary. Everyone knew better than to clutter the moment. I stayed with the aircraft, engines hot, scanning instruments and horizon at the same time, listening to the wind curl and snap around the fuselage. Minutes stretched, then longer. Through night vision, I watched shapes move between shadows. The dogs fanned out, covering ground fast, doubling back without prompting, recalibrating their search patterns, as if adjusting to information no human could sense. Every so often, one would pause, test the air, then push forward again. Then, one dog stopped. She sat down hard, tail still, posture locked. She turned her head and looked back toward the aircraft. Toward me. I do not know why that moment cut through everything else. Maybe it was because she did not look at her handler. She did not look at the terrain. She looked at me steady and certain, as if confirming something had finally aligned. Then she barked. Once. The sound carried farther than it should have. Handlers broke into a run. The rest of the dogs converged instantly, noses driving them toward a shallow depression hidden by scrub and rock. I left the cockpit without thinking. grabbing my kit and moving as fast as the ground allowed. The pilot was there. What was left of the aircraft formed a twisted shell around him, metal bent inward like clenched fingers. He was alive. Barely. His breathing was shallow. Skin pale under dirt and fuel residue, one leg pinned, one arm burned. His eyes opened when a light hit his face, unfocused but present. Hypothermia had already set in. Desert nights do not forgive delay. The dogs stayed close but out of the way, trained enough to know when space was needed. One pressed against the pilot's side briefly, warmth transferred through layers of gear. Another scanned outward, ears rotating, ensuring nothing approached unseen. Extraction was slow, painfully slow. Tools slipped. Metal resisted. Time stretched thin. Wind picked up, cutting through gloves, stealing heat from skin faster than we could replace it. The pilot groaned once, then went quiet again, jaw clenched as medics worked. At one point, I caught Keller's face in the edge of my vision. He was kneeling in the dirt, holding a light steady, eyes fixed on the pilot. He did not speak, he did not give orders. He just stayed there, present, hands steady. When we finally freed the pilot, lifting him clear inch by inch, it felt less like success and more like relief narrowly earned. He was loaded onto a litter, wrapped tight, oxygen flowing. The dogs were loaded last, just as they had insisted on being first. I lifted off as soon as we were clear. The aircraft felt lighter, even with the added weight. Maybe it was the absence of uncertainty. Maybe it was knowing we were leaving with what we came for. As the ground dropped away, the noise inside the cabin faded into something distant and manageable. No one spoke. Not because there was nothing to say, but because words would have broken the fragile quiet holding us together. I remember looking back once, catching the reflection of night in the cockpit glass. Dogs settled low, handlers leaning into familiar shapes. Medics focused and calm, a pilot breathing because a chain of decisions had bent instead of breaking. Every breath in that aircraft felt earned, not triumphant, not proud, just real. And as the lights of base came back into view, I understood something I had not fully grasped before. Trust does not always move down a chain of command. Sometimes it moves sideways, sometimes it moves on four legs, and sometimes it arrives before permission ever does. The pilot survived. Barely. The kind of survival measured in heartbeats and hospital lights instead of certainty. He was transferred off base before sunrise, still unconscious, wrapped in wires and tubing, his life balanced on decisions made in darkness and dust. When we returned, there was no applause waiting for us. No handshakes, no raised voices. Just the familiar hum of a base settling back into routine. The aircraft cooled where it stood, metal ticking softly as heat bled away. Crew chiefs moved in silence. Handlers led the dogs off one by one, checking paws, rubbing ears, murmuring things meant only for them. Everyone understood that what had happened did not fit cleanly into any report. I shut down the engines and sat for a moment longer than necessary, hands still on the controls. Adrenaline drains slowly when it has nowhere to go. Outside, dawn crept in low and pale, painting the hangars in a color that made everything feel temporary. Lieutenant Keller stood alone near the far edge of the hangar, no team around him. No clipboard, no radio pressed to his ear. Just a man staring at the ground where the dust had finally settled. His shoulders looked heavier than they had hours earlier. I did not plan to talk to him. I had learned not to chase closure in the military. It rarely comes wrapped the way you expect. But as I stepped down from the aircraft, he looked up and met my eyes. He walked over slowly, no rush, no stiffness, just tired. He did not apologize. He did not explain. He did not mention protocol or command authority or how close we had come to violating both. He simply said he had never seen dogs disobey like that. Not once. Not in training. Not in combat. Not ever. He paused, as if weighing the words that followed. Then he said maybe some things were not about rank. That was it. No handshake. No correction. No formal acknowledgement of what the dogs had chosen or what I had represented to them in that moment. But something in his posture shifted when he said it, like a weight he had been carrying alone had finally been set down. I nodded, not because I needed his approval, but because I understood what it cost him to say those words out loud. We stood there for a few seconds longer, listening to the base wake up. Vehicles starting. Doors slamming. A normal morning building itself on top of a night that had almost gone very wrong. Then he turned and walked back toward his team, toward handlers kneeling beside dogs, checking gear, tracing familiar scars and reassuring themselves that everyone had made it back. I watched the dogs for a moment. They moved like they always had, focused, calm, back inside the structure of routine as if nothing unusual had happened at all. But something had changed. Not in the dogs, in the people. Later, when the reports were written, the language would be careful. Decisions softened. Sequences simplified. There would be no line for the moment when training gave way to instinct. No checkbox for the quiet choice, 24 animals made without being asked. That was fine. Not everything that matters fits on paper. As I walked back toward my quarters, exhaustion finally catching up, I thought about how close we had come to missing the pilot. About how easily the day could have ended with an empty seat and a folded flag. Survival, I had learned, often comes down to moments no one plans for. Decisions made in seconds. Trust extended without permission. And sometimes recognition arrives not as praise or apology, but as a single sentence spoken quietly at dawn. It was not an apology. It was enough. The exercise was shut down before noon. Officially, it was due to scheduled conflicts and safety reviews. Unofficially, everyone knew it was because no one wanted to pretend the last 24 hours fit neatly into a training box. The range went quiet. Vehicles turned back early. Radios that had been alive all morning settled into long stretches of silence. Reports were written the way reports always are. Carefully, words chosen to reduce friction. Decisions framed as collective. Details smoothed until the edges disappeared. There were no raised issues, no formal challenges. No mention of dogs refusing orders or a mission changing shape on the flight line. On paper, everything unfolded within acceptable limits. Reality stayed between the lines. The canine unit packed up that afternoon. Crates loaded. Gear checked twice. Dogs watered, fed, brushed down until their coats shone again. Handlers moved slower than usual, hands lingering longer on familiar necks and shoulders. I watched Staff Sergeant Olivia Barnes kneel in the dirt with her dog, forehead pressed briefly against his, eyes closed like she was memorizing the weight of him. They hugged their dogs longer than normal. No one commented on it. The trucks rolled out in a line, dust following them down the access road until the base swallowed it back up. The airfield felt larger once they were gone, emptier, like something essential had passed through and left a quiet behind. Life moved on the way it always does. Flights resumed, crews rotated. New exercises were scheduled. I kept flying. Rescue calls, training runs. Long nights stitched together by routine and responsibility. 2 more years passed before I turned in my gear and walked away from service life for the last time. People ask what moments stay with you after you leave. They expect stories about gunfire or close calls or medals. They expect drama. I think about the dogs. I think about the second when training stopped and choice took its place. About 24 animals trained to follow deciding, together, that something else mattered more in that moment. About handlers trusting what they saw even when it broke every rule they lived by. I think about trust. How fragile it looks on the outside, how heavy it feels when it lands on you without warning. That day changed the way I understood belonging. not in terms of acceptance or approval, but in the quiet recognition that comes when others sense your intent before you speak. When presence matters more than permission, I still hear the rotors sometimes when the wind shifts just right, still smell dust and fuel when memory catches me off guard, and every time my mind goes back to that ramp, to dogs sitting in the dirt, to a line that refused to be crossed. Some lessons do not come with rank or ceremony. They arrive in moments no one plans for and leave without asking to be remembered. But they stay anyway. They stay because they remind you that trust is not given by command. It is earned in silence. And once it finds you, it does not forget. People ask me why I stayed calm that day. I usually give a simple answer. The truth is, I did not feel brave at all. I felt seen. In a way that does not happen often in uniform, and almost never when tension is already thick in the air. Those dogs did not know my rank. They did not know my gender. They did not know about the conversations happening behind closed doors, or the quiet doubts passed between people who thought I could not hear them. None of that mattered to them. They recognized intent, presence, familiarity with danger and responsibility. That kind of recognition cuts straight through noise. Leadership does not always announce itself. Sometimes it does not wear the rank you expect or follow the path laid out in manuals. Sometimes it appears in moments when rules begin to bend and someone has to decide whether to hold on to structure or lean into trust. I never flew with those dogs again. Our paths crossed once, briefly, and then moved apart the way military lives often do. But their choice stayed with me. Every time someone questioned whether I belonged in that seat, whether I had earned the right to be there, I thought back to them sitting in the dust. Calm, certain, waiting without hesitation. That memory has carried more weight than any commendation or line in a service record. It reminds me that belonging is not always granted by approval. Sometimes it is recognized quietly by those who know danger best. Subscribe to my channel, Lady Veteran Stories, for more real military stories, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from.